My mother sold all my stuff while I was mourning my dead father, but when I found out she'd been living for 8 years in a house I just inherited, I made her pay rent and destroyed my stepdad's life forever. I'm 23 years old. I work at a coffee shop downtown, and honestly, I need to tell this story because what happened like 6 months ago still runs through my head every time I think about it. My dad, Christopher, died of a heart attack, and in the middle of all that pain, I discovered that my mom had been selling my stuff behind my back while I was grieving. And then, as if that wasn't enough, it turns out I inherited the house where she was living with her new husband. I mean, it's crazy when I say it like that. Like altogether, it sounds like a cheap soap opera, but I swear every word is true. I guess I should start at the beginning, when my parents got divorced. I was like 12 years old, I think, and it was a super ugly divorce, one of those where they scream and throw things at each other, you know? My mom, Margaret, kept the house at that time because my dad basically told her to keep it, that he was going to get something smaller for the two of us when I stayed with him on weekends. But the thing is that after the divorce, my mom kind of distanced herself a lot. I don't know if it was because she was hurt or what, but suddenly I was more of a burden than her son. Like a year passed and she met Scott, this guy who had 2 kids from a previous marriage, Mason and Isabella. And overnight they got married, and suddenly I had a new family I didn't ask for. My dad, on the other hand, was my favorite person in the entire world. He was divorced, lived alone in a small but cozy apartment, worked in construction, and always smelled like wood and that industrial soap they use on construction sites, you know? The weekends I spent with him were the best. We'd go fishing, watch movies until late. He'd teach me how to fix things around the house. He never made me feel like I was a burden or a problem. When I turned 18, I basically moved in with him permanently because at my mom's house, the situation had become unbearable. Literally unbearable. Scott was, and still is, an asshole. I say it that plainly because there's no other way to describe him. He was one of those guys who looks at you like you're trash, who makes passive-aggressive comments all the time, and who clearly saw his own kids as the only thing that mattered in the world. My mom became a different person with him. Like she took his side on everything, and when I tried to talk to her about how I felt, she'd just say I was being dramatic or that Scott was going through a lot of stress. Mason and Isabella, Scott's kids, were young. They were like 10 and 8 years old when all this started, and honestly, they weren't bad kids, but Scott spoiled them in a ridiculous way, and my mom also started treating them better than me. So I moved in with my dad when I was 18, and it was the best decision of my life. I got a job at the coffee shop, started saving, and my dad and I had an amazing relationship. But then, like 8 months ago, my dad started feeling sick. At first, we thought it was exhaustion, you know. He worked a lot. He was 52 years old and construction is tough, but he started complaining about chest pains and one day he collapsed at work. They took him to the hospital, and the doctors said his heart was weak, that he needed rest and constant care. I moved back into his apartment to take care of him, left my job for a part-time one so I could be with him most of the day. It was like 2 months of watching him deteriorate little by little, and it was horrible, absolutely horrible. I called my mom several times to tell her how he was doing, and she always had excuses not to come see him, like Scott needed this or that the kids had activities, that it was too much of a trip. I was angry, but didn't have time to process that because I was too busy taking care of my dad. One morning, it was like 6 in the morning, I heard a noise in his room, and when I went in, I found him on the floor. I called emergency services, but it was too late. The heart attack was massive, and he died, before the ambulance arrived. I was 23 years old and had just lost the only person in the world who really loved me. And I don't know if I've ever felt pain as deep as that. Like physical. Like someone had ripped something out from inside me. I called my mom that same morning, crying. I could barely speak, and I told her, "Mom, Dad died," and her response was, "Oh well, these things happen. Let me know about the funeral arrangements." Just like that. No emotion, no comfort, nothing. I stood there with the phone in my hand thinking, really? That's it? But I was so in shock that I couldn't even process her coldness in that moment. The next few days were a total blur. Uncle Benjamin, my dad's brother, came from another state to help me with everything. He was incredible, honestly. He took care of the funeral arrangements, the paperwork, Everything I couldn't handle because I was too devastated. My mom came to the funeral with Scott and the kids, stayed like 20 minutes, gave me an awkward hug, and left. She didn't even stay for the burial. Like 2 weeks passed, and I was living in my dad's apartment, trying to gather the strength to start packing his things and look for a smaller place for me because the rent was expensive. And then one day, a neighbor from my mom's house, a lady who had always been kind to me when I was a kid, called me. She said, "Honey, I don't know if you know this, but your mom is selling your stuff." I said, "What? What are you talking about?" And she explained that my mom had put up for sale on Facebook and in community groups a bunch of my belongings, stuff I had left in my old room when I moved in with my dad, like my video games, my comic collection, my old laptop, even clothes and furniture that were mine. I was paralyzed. I asked her, "Are you sure?" And she said, "Yes, and she's also saying you moved out and don't need them." I hung up and called my mom immediately, and when she answered, I said, "Did you sell my stuff?" And she, super casual, said, "Well, yes, we needed the money and you weren't using them." I yelled at her. "What do you mean I wasn't using them? I was taking care of my dying father." And she just said, "Well, it's done now. And besides, Scott and I need to buy things for Mason and Isabella for school." I couldn't believe it. I literally couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told her, "Mom, those things were mine. You couldn't do that without asking me," and she just replied, "They were living in my house. Technically, they were mine." I hung up because I felt like I was going to explode, and I sat there on my dad's couch feeling like everything around me was falling apart. My dad had just died. My mom had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and I had no idea what to do. I called Uncle Benjamin and told him everything. He got furious, like I'd never heard him so angry. He told me, "Listen, you need to come here because there's something you need to know about the house." His place as soon as possible, that he had found something in my dad's papers that was going to change everything. I drove like 3 hours to where my uncle lived, and when I got there, he showed me my dad's will. Turns out my dad, when he divorced my mom, had specified in the divorce agreement that she could live in the house until I turned 25 or until she remarried, whichever came first. When she married Scott, technically the house should have gone back to being my dad's, but my dad never did anything about it because, according to my uncle, he didn't want to cause problems and thought that eventually the house would be mine anyway. But the important thing is that in my dad's will, which he had updated like 3 years ago, the house was in my name, completely in my name. My mom had been living in a house that was legally mine for years without knowing it. My uncle explained that my dad had never told my mom about the divorce clause because he wanted to keep things peaceful, but that he had left everything clearly established in his will to protect me. I don't know what I felt in that moment, like it was a mix of relief and rage and sadness all together. My dad had been taking care of me even after death, and my mom had been selling my stuff, thinking I had no power. My uncle told me, "You need to go there with these papers and let her know that house is yours, and that if she continues with this attitude, you're going to evict her." The next day, my uncle and I went to the house. I knocked on the door, and my mom opened with that annoyed face she always makes when she sees me, like I was some bothersome salesman. She said, "What do you want?" I didn't say anything, just walked in with my uncle behind me. Scott was in the living room, sitting in his stupid recliner watching TV, and when he saw me, he got up and said, "Who gave you permission to just walk into my house like that?" My uncle spoke before I could say anything. He said, "House belongs to my nephew." My mom laughed, like a nervous laugh, and said, "What are you talking about? This is my house. Christopher left it to me in the divorce." And my uncle pulled out the papers and said, "No, Margaret, Christopher let you live here under certain conditions, and when you remarried Scott, the house should have gone back to him. But since he never bothered to do the paperwork, he left it in his will directly to his son. Here are the documents. If you want, you can call your lawyer and verify." My mom's face changed completely. She went pale and grabbed the papers, read them, and then looked at Scott. He also read them and turned red with rage. He started yelling that this was illegal, that they had rights, that we couldn't do this. My uncle, super calm, told him, "You can verify with whoever you want, but the reality is that this house isn't yours, and my nephew has every right to ask you to leave." Scott approached my uncle in a threatening way and said, "You're not going to come here with your shit papers and tell me what to do." I got between them and told him, "Scott, back off. You don't want to make this worse than it already is." But he pushed me. And when I say pushed, I mean he threw me against the wall, and then he tried to push my uncle too. My uncle, who's bigger than Scott, didn't move, and at that moment I called the police. When they arrived, I explained the situation, showed them the documents, told them Scott had been violent. The cops checked everything, talked to my mom and Scott, and basically told them it was true, that the house was legally mine and that I had the right to ask them to leave. Scott started yelling at the cops, saying this was robbery, how could they let us do this? And one of the cops told him, "Sir, calm down or we're going to have to arrest you for disturbing the peace." My mom was crying at that point, but they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of rage. She looked at me and said, "You're going to throw your own mother out on the street?" And I, with all the calm I could muster, told her, "Mom, you sold my stuff while I was mourning my father's death. You treated me like garbage for years, and now you're living in a house that isn't yours. I'm not going to throw you out on the street, but Scott leaves today, and if you want to stay, you're going to have to pay me rent." Scott exploded again, but the cops took him out of the house before he could do anything else. They told him he had 24 hours to get his things, and that if he came back without permission, they'd arrest him for trespassing. My mom stood there in the middle of the living room, looking at me with pure hatred, and all she said was, "I'll never forgive you for this." I told her, "That's fine, Mom, because I'm not going to forgive you for everything you did to me either," and I left the house with my uncle. We stayed outside waiting for Scott to gather what he could in an hour, and when he came out with a couple of suitcases, he shot me a death glare but didn't say anything. He got in his truck and left. During the following days, things were weird. My mom stayed in the house, didn't talk to me, basically avoided me when I went to check on things. But Mason and Isabella, Scott's kids, came up to me one afternoon. Mason, who was already like 16 years old, told me, "Hey, I know things are bad, but I want you to know that we had nothing to do with what Mom Margaret did." And Isabella, who was like 14, told me, "And we saved some of your stuff before she sold it. We hid it in the garage." I don't know what I felt in that moment, like a mix of gratitude and sadness because those kids, who didn't have to worry about me, had done more for me than my own mother. I went to the garage with them, and sure enough, there was a box with some of my favorite comics, a few video games, and some old photos I thought I'd lost forever. I thanked them, told them it meant a lot to me, and Mason said, "We always thought you were cool, and we're really sorry about everything that happened." Like a week later, I got a call from an unknown number. It was a woman who introduced herself as Scott's ex-wife. She told me she had found out that Scott had been living with my mom for years and that she had been looking for him because he owed her years of child support for Mason and Isabella. Turns out Scott had disappeared off the map when he married my mom, had changed jobs several times to avoid being found, and had basically been evading his financial responsibilities to his own children. She explained that she hadn't seen her kids in years because Scott took them when they separated, and she didn't have the resources to fight legally at that time. She asked me if I'd be willing to testify about the time Scott lived in the house to prove he had stable income and could have been paying child support. I told her yes, that I'd gladly help, because Scott was a piece of trash who deserved to face the consequences of his actions. I also told her that Mason and Isabella were still living with my mom, and that if she wanted, I could help arrange a meeting. She started crying on the phone, saying she'd been looking for her kids for years and didn't know they were so close. I gave her my address, told her to come whenever she wanted, and that I'd talk to the kids first to prepare them. I talked to Mason and Isabella that night. I told them that their biological mom had been looking for them, that Scott had lied to them about her, and that she wanted to see them if they agreed. Both were quiet for a while, and then Mason said, "We always knew Dad was lying to us about Mom." Isabella added, "We thought she didn't care about us." I told them that wasn't true, that their mom had been looking for them, and that Scott was the one who had been blocking all contact. The reunion was emotional. Like I cried, and she wasn't even my mom. She hugged her kids and didn't let go for like 10 minutes, and they were crying too. It was beautiful and devastating at the same time. My mom was there watching everything with a stone face, not saying anything. After that, the kid's biological mom started legal proceedings to regain custody and to sue Scott for years of unpaid child support. Scott tried to come back to the house a couple of times, always yelling and threatening, but I had changed the locks and had made it clear that if he came near, I was going to call the police. Eventually, he stopped showing up when he found out his ex-wife was suing him and that he could go to prison for child support evasion. My mom and I have talked a couple of times since then, but the relationship is broken, like beyond any repair. She still lives in the house, pays the rent I ask for, and we basically live like strangers under the same roof when we coincide. Mason and Isabella now live with their biological mom most of the time, but they come visit me sometimes because, according to them, I'm the only person in this whole situation who was honest with them. Last week I was organizing my dad's room in the house, because I finally decided to move in there permanently, and I found a letter he had left me with his will. It said he loved me, that he was proud of me, and that the house was his way of making sure I always had a place to land, no matter what happened. I cried like I hadn't cried since his funeral, and I realized that my dad was always taking care of me, even when he wasn't here anymore. I don't know if things will ever get better with my mom. Honestly, I don't think they will. But I have the house. I have a place that's mine, and I have the peace of knowing my dad did everything he could to protect me. And that, I guess, is enough for now.